All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Now, today we'll be talking about the refugee crisis faced by India post partition. ठीक है, इसमें डिस्कस क्या क्या करना है. The immediate problems faced by the refugees, the response of the Indian authorities in providing them relief and finally rehabilitating them, the experience of the refugees and the process of rehabilitation in different parts of India. So there were roughly three main parts of India where the migrant crisis took place. In the northwest, that is the Delhi, Punjab belt. In the northeast, that is West Bengal and Manipur, along with Tripura. It should rather be east and northeast. And in western India, that is Gujarat, Maharashtra region, where the bulk of the Sindhi migrants came from. And then we are going to look at the effects of partition, how it permanently scarred the soul of India. In fact, this should be the effects of the refugee crisis, wherein we will be talking about its political, economic, and cultural effects. Right. First of all, the immediate problems faced by the refugees. So, what kinds of problems do you think were faced by refugees in the immediate sense? There was loss of life, loss of dignity, loss of property at a large scale. The migration of Indians from both sides of the border following partition is the largest forced migration in all of human history. So you can understand the scale of the issue, scale of the problem, right? Now, India at that point of time was not ready for such a crisis, and this complicated matters further because refugees were pouring in from all sides in large numbers and they had to be accommodated within the already overpopulated country. They had to be provided land, they had to be provided funds, जिसकी कमी थी, right? Further, law and order machinery was not strong enough in order to provide them security, so they faced a large number of problems as well. So crime बहुत बढ़ गया, truancy बहुत बढ़ गई, right? Employment opportunities were not adequately present. Land which had to be distributed was of poor quality and was of lesser size than the land that they had left behind in their homes. So these were the kinds of problems that they had to overcome. ठीक है, write down. The people of Bengal and Punjab, the people of Bengal and Punjab faced a great degree of uncertainty, faced a great degree of uncertainty at the time of partition, at the time of partition. Mountbatten Plan याद है? It had provided for the establishment of a boundary commission under Sir Cecil Radcliffe to partition the states of Punjab and Bengal. However, while partition took place formally on the 15th of August 1947, the Boundary Commission had not yet announced its award. They would have to wait for another 3 days. On the 18th of August 1947, the Boundary Commission finally announced its award. ठीक है, write down. Same point में ही, the Boundary Commission announced its award on the 18th of August 1947. 1947. Full stop. The general atmosphere of hatred created by the Muslim League's direct action program led to an enhanced sense of anxiety. Full stop. Next point. Chaos erupted as Lahore was given to Pakistan. Full stop. Its Hindu and Sikh residents had expected it to be part of India. Full stop. Next point. Both India and Pakistan assured their religious minorities of full state protection. But were unable to convince sizable sections of their minorities to stay in place. Full stop. So lakhs upon lakhs of people started to migrate on both sides of the border. Or were they going out of their own free will? No, they were being pressurized to go out. At least that was the feeling. So were they happy about it? No. Resentment was very strong and it boiled over in several places. Next point likho. Popular resentment boiled over taking the shape of communal outbursts. Full stop. और जब खबर आई that people had been attacked, some people had been killed, women had been molested, their dignity had been snatched away, when these kinds of news reached the majority dominated regions of both Bengal and Punjab, तो क्या result होगा उसका? Kind of revenge वाली feeling आएगी, right? क्या लिखा है अभी आपने? Boiled over of communal outbursts. Full stop. This resulted or this triggered a major communal pogrom. POGROM. Pogrom मतलब होता है systematic genocide. ठीक है? Pogrom on both sides of the border, which could not be calmed for several months. For several months. Full stop. Next point, which could not be calmed for several months. अगला पॉइंट लिखो. The law and order machinery. The law and order machinery was poorly equipped. Was poorly equipped to handle such a major crisis and failed to protect the lives, property and dignity, lives, property and dignity of the minorities, of the minorities. Full stop. Subpoint. More than 1 crore people were forced to flee, were forced to flee and more than 10 lakh were slaughtered, were slaughtered. Such a massive humanitarian crisis had never occurred before or since India's partition, or since India's partition. ना पार्टीशन के पहले कभी इतना बड़ा ह्यूमैनिटेरियन क्राइसिस हुआ, ना उसके बाद आज तक हुआ है. Such a massive humanitarian crisis had never occurred before or since India's partition. Next point. Women, children and the elderly were the worst hit or were the worst affected, were the worst affected. Full stop. Next point. The problems of the migrants did not end at the end of their journeys, did not end at the end of their journeys. Full stop. Those who survived, their ordeal, ORDEL, ordeal, found themselves without food, shelter, clean drinking water, or medicine, Full stop. Next point. They were constantly threatened. Without the presence of adequate police protection. Without the presence of adequate police protection. They were constantly threatened without the presence of adequate police protection. Next sub point. The most painful was their immense sense of loss. Was their immense sense of loss. Full stop. Their lives had been completely uprooted, and many would be permanently separated from their loved ones. From their loved ones. Okay? So the emotional trauma suffered by them was the worst kind of wound. Next, a response. Give this heading. A response to the refugee crisis. A response to the refugee crisis. और उसमें 3 सब हेडिंग्स. ए, नॉर्थ वेस्टर्न इंडिया, दिल्ली पंजाब बेल्ट. नॉर्थ वेस्टर्न इंडिया, दिल्ली पंजाब बेल्ट. Write down. The largest number of refugees. The largest number of refugees came to this region. Came to this region. Full stop. Providing security. Providing security. Food. Clothing. Food. Clothing. Shelter. Medicine. Water. And sanitation were the immediate tasks. Were the immediate tasks before the administration. Before the administration to provide relief. To provide relief to these victims of partition. To these victims of partition. Full stop. Next point. For months, comma, they had to live under open skies. Comma, on roadsides, along railway lines, or in makeshift camps. Makeshift camps matlab temporary camps, or in makeshift camps in cities such as Jalandhar, Kurukshetra, Delhi, Faridabad, etc. etc. Delhi, Faridabad, etc. Next point. A rehabilitation commission was set up with the task of A and B. A, reuniting separated family members. separated family members. तो जब flee कर रहे थे तो many people had gotten separated, some people had even been kidnapped, some were being held for ransom, right? So एक common data center होना चाहिए where people could get information about their family members, कि अगर वो बाद में आ रहे हैं तो कहाँ पे हैं इस समय, कौन से कैंप में है, क्या पता है, हाउ टू रीच देम. तो ये काइंड इस डेटा सेंटर का काम करना था. एंड बी, टू रिहेबिलिटेट the refugees both physically and emotionally. Full stop. Next point. अब पंजाब से ज्यादातर लोग जो आ रहे थे, what was their profession? Agriculture. Most of them were farmers. And how to rehabilitate them? By giving them land. ठीक है, so write down. Most migrants from Punjab were farmers who had to be provided land in order to rebuild their lives. Full stop. Next point. Land distribution was done in two phases. A and B. A, a small parcel of land was assigned to each family. And B, further distribution was done on the basis of claimed loss and graded cut. Next main point लिखो. और ये डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन के लिए लैंड आया कहां से? The lands that Muslim migrants from India had left behind when they had migrated to Pakistan. Write down. Land left behind by Muslim migrants from India to Pakistan was distributed among the India-bound refugees. Why do you think दो phases में? एक में, पहले phase में small parcel of land to every farming family, and further redistribution in the second phase on the basis of claimed loss and graded cut. ऐसा क्यों? Why not distribute land simply on the basis of the land that these people had left behind, the loss that they were claiming? Why not do that? Because उसको करने में टाइम लगता है, राइट? इट वुड हैव रिक्वायर्ड अ ग्रेट डिग्री ऑफ डेटा कलेक्शन एंड देन वेरिफिकेशन. ये जो लोग क्लेम कर रहे हैं वो सही बात है या नहीं है, राइट? एंड इट वाज इम्पोर्टेंट टू गिव these people, these refugees, the basic facilities of life so that they could survive till the next phase. So that is why in the first phase a small parcel of land was distributed equally among all the refugees. सेकेंड फेज में क्या है? क्लेम लॉस एंड ग्रेडेड कट. क्लेम लॉस का मतलब ये क्या प्रिंसिपल हुआ? जितना लैंड छोड़ के आए हैं उतना इनको यहाँ पे मिलना चाहिए. However, the land left behind was of much higher quality and of much larger size than the land that was available in India, and that is why it had to be cut. और graded cut को apply कैसे किया गया? Was it done simply in direct proportion to the land that was left behind? No. तो मान लो कोई ऐसा फार्मर है जो 100 एकर्स ऑफ लैंड छोड़ करके आया है, एक ऐसा फार्मर है जो 50 एकर्स ऑफ लैंड छोड़ के आया है, और कोई ऐसा फार्मर है जो 5 एकर्स ऑफ लैंड छोड़ करके आया है, राइट? नाउ लेट अस से द टोटल लैंड कितना छोड़ करके आए हैं ये? 155 एकर्स, राइट? The total amount of land that is available in India is only 25 acres, right? तो अगर proportionally divide कर दिया गया तो this person would get the largest share, that is roughly 2/3 of the land, about 18 or 19 acres of land, which would make the other smaller farmers completely unviable, right? क्योंकि उनके पास उतना लैंड रहेगा ही नहीं कि सर्वाइव कर सके आगे. तो दैट इज वाई डिसप्रपोर्शनल तरीके से कट को अप्लाई किया गया. दैट इज वाई इट इज नोन एज ग्रेडेड कट. So this farmer would be given, let us say, 3 acres of land. This farmer would be given, let us say, 8 acres of land. And बचा कितना? 14 acres of land that would be given to the person who had left behind 100 acres of land. ठीक है? तो proportionally नहीं अप्लाई किया गया, किस तरह से अप्लाई किया गया? नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. हाँ, was redistributed among the India bound refugees. Was redistributed among the India bound refugees. Were these India bound refugees happy with this mechanism? No. Why? They felt that the lands that they had left behind in western Punjab was of far greater quality and of far larger size than the lands that they were being given in India. Write down. However, next point. However, the general complaint was that their new lands were too little and less fertile than the land they had left behind. जो peasant refugees हैं वो तो villages से आ रहे थे, तो they would be resettled in the rural areas. How about the urban migrants? लाहौर से जो लोग आ रहे हैं, मुल्तान से जो लोग आ रहे हैं, they would have to be resettled in the urban areas. तो उनको कैसे किया गया? Next point, write down. Refugee colonies were set up in cities such as Jalandhar, Delhi, and Faridabad to resettle the urban migrants, the urban refugees. और यहाँ पे कंस्ट्रक्शन कैसे अंडरटेक किया गया? Did the government build housing societies for them? No, they provided them financial assistance to both set up their businesses as well as construct their new houses. Write down. Financial assistance, सब पॉइंट में लिख सकते हो. Financial assistance was provided to them to set up new businesses and construct their houses. A prime example of a refugee colony जहाँ पे आप अभी बैठे हुए हैं, राजेंद्र नगर, मॉडल टाउन, ये सब रेफ्यूजी कॉलोनीज, राइट? So this was the experience of the refugees who were migrating from Western Punjab towards Eastern Punjab, towards the Punjab Delhi belt. Clear? Next, East and Northeast India. East and Northeast India. That is West Bengal, Manipur and Tripura belt. हाँ नहीं, नेक्स्ट सब हेडिंग, जैसे ये ए था ना, ए बी, इंडियन रिस्पॉन्स में नेक्स्ट सेक्टर, ईस्ट एंड नॉर्थ ईस्ट इंडिया, वेस्ट बंगाल एंड मणिपुर त्रिपुरा रीजन. इस रीजन में प्रॉब्लम क्या हुआ, that unlike northwestern India where there was two-way migration, over here there was only one-way migration. A large number of people came from East Pakistan to India, but nobody went from India towards East Pakistan. ठीक है, write down. A major complication of the refugee crisis was that of the refugee crisis in East India, was that migration was a one-way affair. That is, from East Pakistan towards India. Full stop. Next point. Therefore, there was virtually no land or property to be distributed among the incoming refugees. Full stop. Next point. Most refugees in Bengal remained concentrated in Calcutta, where large slums sprouted up. Full stop. They faced severe problems such as the lack of basic amenities, healthcare, education, full stop. Employment opportunities were also poor. Since the economy was unable to absorb the additional workforce. The additional workforce. ठीक है. Now पंजाब और बंगाल के जो रेफ्यूजी क्राइसिस है उसमें एक और बड़ा डिफरेंस था. इन पंजाब the mix of refugees coming to India was quite diverse. There were some poor, there were some rich people, there were some small farmers, there were some big farmers, there were some skilled laborers, there were some unskilled laborers. But in Bengal problem kya tha? All of them were illiterate, poor and unskilled. So therefore, even when employment opportunities appeared for them, it would not be able to propel them into higher sections of the society. So they would be confined to a life of perpetual poverty. So write down. Another problem, sub point. Another problem was that the bulk of refugees, the bulk of refugees in the east, were poor, illiterate and unskilled, which further deepened the crisis, Full stop. Next main point. Some refugees from East Pakistan also migrated towards the Assam Valley and the tribal dominated regions of Tripura and Manipur. The extent of their problems, would it be greater or lesser than the migrants who had traveled to Calcutta or West Bengal? Greater. क्यों? क्योंकि वहां पे तो भाषा सेम है, कल्चर सेम है. यहाँ पे भाषा कल्चर दोनों अलग है. राइट. राइट डाउन. They faced hostility. Sub point. They faced hostility from locals due to linguistic, cultural and ethnic differences. Full stop. Next sub point. The problem was the most severe in the tribal dominated regions. The problem was most severe in the sparsely populated tribal regions. Was most severe in the sparsely populated tribal regions, where the influx of refugees threatened to change the demographic complexion. ठीक है. So these were sparsely populated regions dominated by tribals, and the sudden influx of a large number of Bangla speaking refugees threatened to permanently alter the demographic complexion of these tribal regions. अब ये जो refugee communities हैं, they were becoming the majority portions of the population. And how would the tribal communities react? They would react with hostility, and this led to political complexities which last to this day. Write down this created political complications that are relevant even today. Even today. And created major hurdles towards the process of tribal integration and nation building in the Northeast. Nation building in the Northeast. So if you look at Manipur, which even now is undergoing major problems, or if you look at the issue of the National Register of Citizens, तो ये सब अभी भी काफी burning issues हैं इंडिया की politics में, and this has resulted in the creation of a sense of resentment among the indigenous tribals of the Northeast, and it has at least emotionally, if not physically, distance the people of the Northeast from mainstream India. So, a feeling of separatism has always been present in the undercurrent of Northeastern politics. ठीक है? And इसकी वजह से कई सारी problems भी हुई. For example, ultra movements took place. Separatist tendencies were present. कई सारे militant outfits emerge हुए. The Assam Rifles and the Indian Army had to conduct several operations in order to suppress these uprisings, to suppress these separatist movements. And finally, after a long process, accord हुए, ट्राइबल इंटीग्रेशन का प्रोसेस आगे बढ़ा, बट ये जो फीलिंग ऑफ इल विल है, फीलिंग ऑफ रिजेंटमेंट है, दैट हैज नॉट कंप्लीटली डिसिपेटेड फ्रॉम द नॉर्थ ईस्ट, एंड इट कंटिन्यूज टू बी अ मेजर चैलेंज टुवर्ड्स नेशनल इंटीग्रेशन. ठीक है, सो दिस वाज द एक्सपीरियंस इन ईस्टर्न एंड नॉर्थ ईस्टर्न इंडिया. नेक्स्ट लिखो सी, वेस्टर्न इंडिया, गुजरात एंड महाराष्ट्र. गुजरात एंड महाराष्ट्र बेल्ट. राइट डाउन. roughly 20 lakh roughly 20 lakh migrants from which state in Pakistan came to this region. गुजरात से लगा हुआ कौन सा स्टेट है? सिंध. ठीक है, फ्रॉम सिंध came to this region in the months following partition. Full stop. Next point. They faced problems similar to refugees in other regions. They faced problems similar to refugees in other regions. They faced problems similar to refugees in other regions. But with even greater complications. greater complications. अब वेस्ट पंजाब से जितने ज्यादातर माई रेफ्यूजीज आए, where did they settle? Either in East Punjab or in present day हरियाणा और दिल्ली. तो यहाँ का कल्चर जो था, इट रिमेन्ड पंजाबी. ईस्ट पाकिस्तान से ज्यादातर लोग कहाँ पर आए? कलकत्ता में आए. तो कल्चर रिमेन्ड दी सेम, so they could be assimilated into the local society of West Bengal. However, ये लोग कहाँ से आ रहे थे? सिंध से. they were linguistically different, they were culturally different. जा कहाँ पे रहे थे? या तो गुजरात में या फिर महाराष्ट्र में, which had their own distinct culture and their own language. So the process of assimilation was far more difficult over here, right? Secondly, they suffered an added sense of loss of culture also. They were completely separated from their homeland, and जो नई जगह पे पहुंचे, वहाँ का लैंग्वेज, वहाँ की रिवायत, वहाँ के रीति रिवाज बिल्कुल अलग थे. ठीक है, राइट डाउन सब पॉइंट. They suffered an added sense of loss of culture, of loss of culture, full stop. The locals of Gujarat and Maharashtra treated them as unwanted outsiders with a foreign identity and culture, with a foreign identity and culture, full stop. This created problems with regards to their assimilation, with regards to their assimilation. Full stop. Next main point. They were discriminated against in matters of business and employment. In matters of business and employment. Full stop. Additionally, the state machinery remained apathetic, remained apathetic to their issues and progress towards rehabilitation, progress towards rehabilitation was slow, was slow. ठीक है, यहाँ पे भी जो माइग्रेशन हो रहा था, वन वे हो रहा था, राइट. मेनी सिंधी फार्मर्स कुड नॉट बी अलॉटेड लैंड ईदर इन गुजरात और महाराष्ट्र. एक तो वैसे ही एरिड कंडीशंस, वहां पर लैंड कम होता है, फर्टिलिटी इज लो, एंड दे वर कमिंग फ्रॉम द वेरी रिच इंडस डेल्टा रीजन, राइट. तो इन लोगों को यहाँ पे ना लैंड मिल रहा था, एंड जो अर्बन माइग्रेंट्स थे, वो जो हेविली पॉपुलेटेड सिटीज, अहमदाबाद हो गया, सूरत हो गया, या फिर बॉम्बे हो गया, वहां पे उनको हाउसिंग एनक्लेव्स बनाने के लिए भी लैंड नहीं था. प्रॉब्लम वाज मोस्ट सिवियर इन बॉम्बे, राइट. एंड majority of the Sindhi urban migrants wanted to go to Bombay. Why? Because Bombay was the financial center, and therefore all the urban as well as rural migrants were forced to come to cities such as Ahmedabad, Surat और Bombay, जहाँ पे उनको once again ghettos में, slums में रहना पड़ा, right? Write down. Due to lack of land, sub point, due to lack of land, and housing, both urban and rural migrants from Sindh had to live in slums in cities such as Ahmedabad, Surat, Ahmedabad, Surat, and Bombay. Full stop. Next point, next main point. लेकिन इनके पास एक ऐसी चीज थी जो कभी छीनी नहीं जा सकती. एंड व्हाट वाज दैट? देयर नेवर से डाई एटीट्यूड एंड the will to rebuild their lives. They also came from very close knit communities. एंड जब बाहर से सपोर्ट नहीं मिला तो अंदर से सपोर्ट मिला. ठीक है, राइट डाउन. Slowly, comma, they were able to rebuild their lives. To emerge as one of the most influential business classes in Western India. Full stop. However, they received little outside or state help. ठीक है. So this was the experience of refugee crisis in different parts of India. Next, effects of the refugee crisis or impact of the refugee crisis. लिखो. More than 15 lakh refugees each arrived in northwestern, western, and eastern India. Full stop. Next point. Roughly 40 lakh Muslim migrants migrated from India towards Pakistan. Full stop. Next point. The largest influx of refugees was seen in the Delhi Punjab belt, causing a major demographic shift. Full stop. Delhi's famous Indo-Islamic culture was destroyed overnight and came to be dominated by Punjabi culture. By Punjabi culture. Came to be dominated by Punjabi culture. पार्टीशन के पहले दिल्ली वालों की जुबान क्या थी? उर्दू, राइट? उसके बाद ज्यादातर पंजाबी. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. In Calcutta and Bengal, in Calcutta and Bengal, comma, communists mobilized migrants. Communists mobilized migrants by providing them relief and promising reforms. And promising reforms. Full stop. Providing relief and promising reforms. Thus, the politics of West Bengal slowly came to be dominated by the Communist Party. Beginning from the 1960s, communists ruled in Bengal for almost 50 years. Okay? And this was because they were able to convince the people, the poor of Bengal, as well as the migrants of Bengal, that Congress is a bourgeois party. It is always going to take the side of the industrialists and the landlords. And this problem was further complicated by the delay in land reforms and delay in industrial reforms in Bengal, right? So that is why communists got a stronghold in Bengal. Next main point likho. In Delhi, comma, the Jan Sangh and RSS became extremely popular due to their relief work among refugees. Due to their relief work among refugees. Full stop. They also benefited from the undercurrent of intense communal hatred. From the undercurrent of intense communal hatred, and succeeded in recruiting the refugee youth. Okay? So major cultural and political shifts we are being able to see. Next subpoint. Next main point. In the Gujarat Bombay region, comma, the influx of Sindhi refugees strengthened which movement? The linguistic movement. Why? Because they felt threatened that now their regions are going to lose their linguistic identity, right? And thus their movements became even stronger, strengthened their linguistic movements. Sindhi refugees strengthened the linguistic movement. The native same point mein, the native Gujarati and Marathi speakers were threatened by the possible dilution of their linguistic identity, by the possible dilution of their linguistic identity. Next main point. In the tribal dominated northeast, comma, the influx of Bengali refugees created political complications which manifested themselves, created political complications which manifested themselves in the form of strong movements for tribal independence, which often became violent, which often became violent. Strong movements for tribal independence, which often became violent. This threatened political stability, national security, and national integration. Political stability, national security, and national integration. Next main point. Did the refugee crisis have any effect on popular culture? Kaise? The theme of the refugee crisis became the most attractive theme to poets, writers, novelists, and short story writers, to cinemakers, musicians, etc. Write down. The theme of the refugee crisis, became prominent within the popular culture. Full stop. The subjects of partition, suffering of the refugees, separation, communal relations, exploitation of women, and human struggle, captured the imaginations, of poets, novelists, short story writers, musicians, painters, and cinemakers. And cinemakers. Full stop. Subpoint. Some important, some important works, some important works touching these themes, touching these themes include Toba Tek Singh, written in Urdu by Manto, Saadat Hassan Manto. Train to Pakistan, English, by Khushwant Singh. Pinjar, Punjabi, by Amrita Pritam. And Tamas, in Hindi, by Bhishma Sahani. By Bhishma Sahani. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. More than 75 years, more than 75 years after partition, after partition, comma, the wounds of the refugee crisis may have been healed, may have been healed, but the scars remain, but the scars remain. Full stop. Subpoint. Poverty, crime, addiction, truancy, truancy, and communal feelings, and communal feelings continue to linger, continue to linger with the refugee communities, with the refugee communities being the worst affected, being the worst affected. Full stop. Next point. This is often perceived to be the result of the generational trauma, the generational trauma of partition, of partition. As such, as such, rehabilitation rehabilitation should not should not focus only upon physical and economic resettlement. Full stop. It should also involve it should also involve cultural protection cultural protection and an emphasis an emphasis on mental health on mental health. क्या समझ में आया? What is this generational trauma that we are talking about? Look, people who underwent partition and the refugee crisis suffered a big trauma to their psychology, right? इस ट्रॉमा के अलग अलग मैनिफेस्टेशंस होते हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इन मेनी केसेस द फैमिली स्ट्रक्चर वाज कंप्लीटली shattered. Many people were separated from their loved ones. Many people had seen how their neighbors had mistreated the most loved and cherished members of their family. Women were targeted. Dignity was at stake, right? And उसकी वजह से रिवेंज का फीलिंग हुआ. They tried to do the same thing to their neighbors, right? And once the human mind gets habituated to violence, it becomes the new normal, right? After things cooled down, after they were resettled, they began searching for new targets. और new targets कौन होंगे? जो सोसाइटी में वीकेस्ट मेंबर्स हैं, either other refugees or even in some cases their own family members. अब उसका केवल ये नहीं होगा that it would always result in crime, robbery, चोरी चकारी. इसका ये मतलब नहीं होता है. It can also lead to domestic violence, child abuse. It could also take the shape of addiction to alcohol or other intoxicants, right? Now the next generation which comes up in a very hostile environment, and वो जो trauma है ना, वो दोबारा से उसको सफर करते हैं. इट इज द ओल्डर जनरेशन विच इन्फ्लिक्ट्स दिस ट्रॉमा अपॉन देम, एंड दिस बिकम्स अ जनरेशनल साइकिल. ठीक है, तो रिहेबिलिटेशन का मतलब केवल ये नहीं होना चाहिए कि जमीन दे दी, घर बनवा दिया, बिजनेस सेटअप करवा दिया. इट देयर शुड आल्सो बी एन इक्वल फोकस ऑन मेंटल हेल्थ, ऑन एजुकेशन, ऑन ऑन इम्प्रूविंग कम्युनिटी रिलेशंस, राइट? तो इन सब की चीज जो सोशल स्ट्रक्चर, सपोर्ट स्ट्रक्चर होता है, उसको स्ट्रेंथन करना चाहिए साथ में, राइट? इंडिया में फोकस किस पे रहा है? इंडिया में ही क्या, हर जहां पे फोकस किस पे रहता है कि आप उनके लिए घर बनवा दो, जमीन दे दो, बिजनेस सेटअप करवा दो एंड देन लीव देम अलोन. दैट इज नॉट सफिशिएंट, राइट? सो दैट दिस इज व्हाट वी मीन. ये हो गया द रेफ्यूजी क्राइसिस. नेक्स्ट टॉपिक दैट विल बी कवरिंग द डेमोक्रेसी एंड फर्स्ट जनरल इलेक्शंस. कैसे कवर करेंगे इसको? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल वी आर गोइंग टू टॉक अबाउट द डेवलपमेंट ऑफ डेमोक्रेसी during the national movement. What was the attitude of the nationalist leadership? Secondly, after the attainment of independence, what was the changing attitude of the Indian leadership towards questions such as when the general election should be held, what should be the basis of the government that is formed, what should be the amount of franchise that is given to the people, क्या डायरेक्ट यूनिवर्सल एडल्ट फ्रैंचाइज, डायरेक्ट इलेक्शंस होने चाहिए या फिर इनडायरेक्ट इलेक्शंस होने चाहिए, पार्लियामेंट्री सिस्टम होना चाहिए या फिर प्रेसिडेंशियल सिस्टम ऑफ गवर्नमेंट होना चाहिए, these kinds of questions. So constitutional debate Then we are going to talk about Pandit Nehru's approach and the first general elections, the steps that had to be taken in order to conduct these elections, the process of these elections कि कैसे हुआ. Then we are going to talk about the parties and their agendas. The response of the Indian people, right? What happened on the day of election. And finally, we are going to talk about the impact or significance of the first general elections. Okay. So first of all, give the heading democracy during the national movement. Democracy during the national movement. Write down. The national movement had been deeply democratic, especially since the formation of the Congress. The formation of the Congress. Full stop. A major demand of the nationalists was the introduction of a limited constitutional of a limited constitutional responsible and democratic government full stop. Next point. Since the beginning of the 20th century, since the beginning of the 20th century, self rule and democracy became the twin objectives of the nationalists. Next main point. Gandhi ji broadened the social base of the movement, thus enlisting virtually all sections of the population, thus enlisting virtually all sections of the population in the struggle for democracy. Full stop. Next main point. From the 1920s onwards, the people of the princely states also joined the struggle for national unification, national independence, struggle for national unification, national independence, and democracy. And democracy. Full stop. Next point. The Nehru Report of 1928 raised the demand. 1928 raised the demand of universal adult franchise. And the abolition of separate electorates to create a self-ruled democratic and secular India. Self-ruled democratic and secular India. Full stop. Next point. The entry of workers and peasants into the national movement further strengthened the case for democracy. Further strengthened the case for democracy. Full stop. Next point. The same pattern was echoed by the rising participation, echoed, ECHOED, echoed by the rising participation of Dalits, Muslims, and women in the national movement. In the national movement. Women, Dalits, Muslim, and women in the national movement. Point we are trying to make that gradually the entire country started coming to the same conclusion that India should be united, India should be free, and India should be democratic. तो ये तीन ऑब्जेक्टिव्स अब पूरे सारे के सारे हिंदुस्तान के वर्चुअली सारे हिंदुस्तान के प्राइमरी ऑब्जेक्टिव्स बन चुके थे. दिस वाज द बेसिस ऑफ द नेशनल स्ट्रगल. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. Therefore, the national movement had a rich legacy of democracy. Full stop. Next heading, constitutional debate. Following the transfer of power, following the transfer of power, comma, a major constitutional debate, a major constitutional debate erupted within the nationalist leadership, within the nationalist leadership, with regards to the following questions, with regards to the following questions, with regards to the following questions. किस इश्यू पे डिबेट हो रहा था? The form of government that should be adopted, the question of timing of the election, and the extent of franchise. ठीक है, तो लिखो A, B and C. Form of government, timing of the election, and extent of franchise. And extent of franchise. With regards to the first question, one group of leaders led by Dr. Rajendra Prasad and C. Rajgopalachari suggested that India should have a presidential form of government, that is indirectly elected. ठीक है, और Pandit Nehru and the others, what did they suggest? That India should have a Westminster system of parliamentary government. With direct elections. ठीक है, write down. A, Dr. Rajendra Prasad and C. Rajgopalachari wanted a presidential government that was indirectly elected. That was indirectly elected. Wanted a presidential government that was indirectly elected. Argument क्या दिया इन्होंने? They felt that India was not yet ready for direct elections, and having a president as both head of government and head of state would be a continuation of the British system of having governor generals in India. ठीक है, write down. They argued, sub point लिख लो. They argued that India was not ready for direct elections. Was not ready for direct elections. And a presidential form of government would represent continuity of the Governor General's office within a republican system, within a governor general's office within a republican system. ठीक है? नेक्स्ट लिखो, पंडित नेहरू, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट ए में ही नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट, पंडित नेहरू, पंडित नेहरू insisted upon a Westminster type parliamentary system with direct elections. Westminster type parliamentary system with direct elections. इन्होंने क्या आर्ग्यू किया? This was going to be a continuation of the Westminster style of British government, and it was the same system which the Congress also had experience with following the 1937 elections. ठीक है, तो वहां पे स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स बनी थी जहां पे प्रोविंशियल ऑटोनॉमी था, तो वहां पे भी प्रीमियर्स या फिर चीफ मिनिस्टर्स होते थे अलग अलग स्टेट्स के. तो द कंट्री आल्सो शुड हैव अ प्राइम मिनिस्टर व्हिच इज हु इज डायरेक्टली इलेक्टेड. एंड इनडायरेक्ट इलेक्शंस क्यों नहीं होने चाहिए? Because that would be against the principle of representative democracy that the freedom fighters had been fighting for since the very beginning. Write down sub point. The Westminster system was the logical choice since Indian democracy was modeled on British democracy. Further, indirect elections would be against the legacy of the national movement. ठीक है. सेकंड क्वेश्चन था टाइमिंग ऑफ द इलेक्शन. क्या? ऑफ द नेशनल मूवमेंट. तो एक इशू में फॉर्म ऑफ गवर्नमेंट में वेस्टमिंस्टर सिस्टम होगा, पंडित नेहरू इंसिस्टेड अपॉन दैट, एंड डायरेक्ट इलेक्शंस होंगे. दूसरा इशू था टाइमिंग ऑफ द इलेक्शन. राइट डाउन. Some prominent members of Nehru's cabinet wanted to delay elections. Why? Because country was facing very severe crises at that point of time. In 1950, at the time of the enactment of the constitution, the country was undergoing a refugee crisis. It was facing food shortages, inflation बहुत high था, poverty बहुत ज़्यादा था, law and order problems were emerging, right wing extremism का खतरा था. Right. Further, a war had recently taken place and India's financial condition was extremely poor. So it was felt that additional burden होगा अगर elections करवाते हैं तुरंत. Right. The state did not have the necessary infrastructure to conduct this election also. Right. So these were the problems that were cited by some prominent members of Nehru's cabinet. Wanted to delay the elections. They argued, they argued, सब पॉइंट करके लिखो. They argued the country, the country was facing severe crises and would not be able to bear the additional burden of general elections. Bear the additional burden of general elections. Next point. The law and order machinery was not equipped to provide the necessary security. Next point. The bulk of voters. Next point. क्या क्या argument थे इनके? Next point. The bulk of voters were illiterate. The rate of illiteracy was as high as 88% in India at that point of time. The bulk of voters were illiterate and were susceptible to caste and communal appeals. Next point. The threat of muscle and money power was extremely strong. Next point. The task of registering voters had not been completed. And would require a massive undertaking. Next point. The infrastructure needed to conduct elections in remote and distant areas needed to conduct elections in remote and distant areas was non-existent. Next point. Ensuring the neutrality of officials would be a big challenge. Next sub point. Both domestic and foreign experts had expressed doubts regarding the preparedness of elections preparedness of elections. And lastly लिखो, if the elections could not be performed successfully could not be performed successfully could not be performed successfully, comma, it would tarnish India's image and could threaten national unity. India's image and would threaten national unity. ठीक है. तो इनको आप ये भी बोल सकते हो, these were the major hurdles in conducting the फर्स्ट नेशनल इलेक्शंस. और इसलिए कई लीडर्स ने ऐसा सजेस्ट किया कि तुरंत नहीं करवाना चाहिए, थोड़ा समय रुक जाइए फिर करवाना चाहिए. राइट. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो इसमें बी में ही, पंडित नेहरू insisted upon conducting the elections as soon as possible arguing that, क्या आर्ग्यूमेंट दिया इन्होंने, that the people would not be able to taste the real fruits of freedom until unless they are able to elect their own governments. ठीक है. Arguing that the ordinary masses would be unable to feel or to taste the real fruits of freedom till they are able to elect their own governments. Next, C, extent of franchise. Once again, C Rajagopalachari and Dr. Rajendra Prasad, इन्होंने क्या सजेस्ट किया, the gradual introduction of universal adult franchise. ठीक है. Write down. Prominent leaders such as Dr. Rajendra Prasad and C Rajagopalachari suggested the gradual introduction of universal franchise. Suggested the gradual introduction of universal franchise. Why? Same set of problems. वो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर नहीं था फुल जनरल इलेक्शंस विद यूनिवर्सल फ्रैंचाइज करने के लिए, खर्चा बहुत ज्यादा करना पड़ता, वो उसकी हालत नहीं थी देश की उस समय. राइट. फर्दर The masses were illiterate, unregistered, they had to be enrolled, registered, campaigning में बहुत सारा पैसा वेस्ट करते, right? So these were the problems that they cited, and ये बोला कि at this stage limited franchise होना चाहिए, property qualifications, educational qualifications के basis पर, and gradually जैसे 5 साल के बाद दोबारा elections होंगे, उस समय तक देश की हालत थोड़ी सुधर जाएगी, तो then incrementally the voting percentage should be increased. People who have the right to vote, that should be increased. ठीक है, next main point लिखो. Pandit Nehru argued that democracy and independence would be meaningless without equality. Full stop. Limited franchise would prolong the exploitation of the underprivileged by the dominant minority. ठीक है, और ऐसी डेमोक्रेसी कोई डेमोक्रेसी नहीं होती है, राइट? तो ये था कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल डिबेट विद रिगार्ड्स टू द इलेक्शंस. नेक्स्ट लिखो, नेहरूज अप्रोच and the first general elections. Write down. Pandit Nehru emerged as a true statesman. Insisting upon direct elections with universal adult franchise. As soon as possible. Full stop. Leading from the front, he convinced other leaders and it was declared that elections would be held in 1951. Next point. The Election Commission of India was set up on the 25th of January 1950. Full stop. Next point. अच्छा, इसमें लिखो, it had, इसी पॉइंट में लिखो, it had one chief election commissioner. कौन थे पहले चीफ इलेक्शन कमिश्नर? Sukumar Sen. Sukumar Sen. Who was he? He was a civil servant with a maths background. Sukumar Sen, an ICS officer with a maths background. An ICS officer with a maths background. Why maths background? Because planning, data analysis और statistics की बहुत जरूरत पड़ने वाली थी. That is why Sukumar Sen was chosen. Next point. The Representation of People's Act. The Representation of People's Act 1951. 1951 provided for elections to Parliament as well as state legislatures with the principle of direct elections. Instead of Parliament, better word would be to write Lok Sabha. ठीक है, Parliament में क्योंकि राज्यसभा भी आ जाता है. Parliament नहीं, उसकी जगह पे लोक सभा कर दो. एंड स्टेट लेजिस्लेचर्स की जगह पे स्टेट लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबलीज कर दो. On the principle of direct elections with universal adult franchise as well as the legislative assemblies on the principle of direct elections with universal adult franchise. With universal adult franchise. Next point. The Election Commission of India, the ECI, began registering voters primarily by using किन फंक्शनरीज को यूज किया? घर घर गांव गांव जाकर के वोटर्स को रजिस्टर करने के लिए टीचर्स, गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स के टीचर्स, प्राइमरीली बाय यूजिंग गवर्नमेंट स्कूल टीचर्स. Full stop. It also began training state officials to conduct elections. Full stop. Simultaneously, it began preparing for the elections by creating the necessary infrastructure, polling booths, transportation, and security apparatus. Necessary infrastructure, polling booths, transportation, and security apparatus. Full stop. Next point. Once the voter list was prepared, it had to be prepared again. It had to be prepared again. हुआ ये था कि many wrongs were proven to be fictitious. ऐसे लोगों के नाम उसमें ऐड हो गए थे जो एग्जिस्ट ही नहीं करते थे. तो होता क्या था दैट स्पेशली इन दी विलेजेस लोगों के फैमिली मेंबर्स उनके निक नेम्स वहां पे लिखवा देते थे वोटर रोल्स में, या फिर विमेन को उनके नाम से ना एड्रेस करके बिकॉज दैट वाज कंसिडर्ड टू बी अ टैबू, तो एड्रेस ऐसे किया जाता था कि सोनू की मम्मी, भोलू की चाची, इस तरह से नाम लिखवाए जाते थे, राइट. सो these were the kinds of problems which had occurred, so it had to be prepared once again since more than 35 lakh names were found to be fictitious. Were found to be fictitious. Full stop. Next point. To overcome the hurdle of mass illiteracy, to overcome the hurdle of mass illiteracy, क्या किया गया? Voters would not be able to read the ballot papers, therefore election symbols were prepared and assigned to the different parties. Election symbols were assigned to overcome the problem hurdle of mass illiteracy, comma, election symbols were assigned to the different parties, to the different parties. Next point. Campaigning was done through newspapers, speeches, public rallies, pamphlets, posters, and door-to-door campaigning. The state-run All India Radio was prohibited from carrying campaign messages. ठीक है, उस समय बहुत सारे प्राइवेट स्टेशंस नहीं होते थे, एंड अपार्ट फ्रॉम द ऑल इंडिया रेडियो, ओनली रेडियो मॉस्को यूज्ड टू ऑपरेट इन इंडिया, एंड सिंस there was no prohibition on radio Moscow from carrying the electoral campaign messages, the Communist Party benefited from that. They were able to use it. Next main point लिखो, और सॉरी, ये तो हो गया नेहरूज अप्रोच एंड द फर्स्ट जनरल इलेक्शंस. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो. the election was planned in several phases between October 1951 to February 1952. Why in several phases? एक साथ क्यों नहीं? हाँ, possible नहीं था, so it would have overburdened the election machinery. Write down. This was done to prevent the overburdening of the election machinery. Next heading, the political agendas of the different parties. Political agendas of the different parties. कांग्रेस का प्लेटफॉर्म क्या था? A progressive and secular society with poverty alleviation and economic development. So write down the Congress 1 2 3 4 करके लिख सकते हो. Number 1, the Congress promised a progressive and secular society. A progressive and secular society with poverty removal and economic growth. And economic growth. Next point. The Jan Sangh. Number 2. The Jan Sangh accused the Congress of minority appeasement and promised to restore Hindu cultural pride. Hindu cultural pride. Number 3. The communists accused the Congress of being a bourgeois party, and promised structural reforms for workers and peasants. कितने हुए? 3. Number 4. The Scheduled Caste Federation accused the Congress of being an upper caste sympathizer, and promised to address the problems of Dalits and women. Address the problems of Dalits and women. Next लिखो. Number 5. The DMK came out with an agenda of Tamil pride. Next लिखो. Number 6. Pro Hindi groups promised to make Hindi the national language. ठीक है? So these were the different agendas. Next लिखो. Next heading. Number 5. The day of the election. Day of the election. Write down. The election began with the चीनी तहसील. कहाँ पे है ये? प्रेजेंट डे हिमाचल प्रदेश. Began in the चीनी तहसील and in several phases was conducted across India. And in several phases was conducted across India. Full stop. The atmosphere was festive. And the people participated in a celebratory mood. Full stop. Next point. Voter turnout was healthy at 58%. Full stop. The voting percentage was highest at Kottayam. कहाँ है? प्रेजेंट डे केरला में. वोट क्या लिखा आपने? वोटर in Kottayam, that is 84%, and lowest at Shahdol, in present day MP, that is 18%. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. The Congress won absolute majorities at both the center and states. So in all the states as well as the center. Won absolute majorities both at the center and states. Almost all top figures of the national movement were elected. But there were a few upsets, such as Dr. Ambedkar and Morarji Desai. So although they had contested and it was felt that they would emerge victorious easily, ऐसा हुआ नहीं. They were unable to win, such as Dr. Ambedkar and Morarji Desai. ठीक है. So this was the response on the day of the election. And finally, the impact or significance of the election. लिखो. The biggest success was the participation of the people in healthy proportions or in healthy numbers with the hope of change. So roughly 60% of the total electorate had turned out to vote and thus they were giving their vote of confidence to India and to the democratic process. So they had placed their trust in it. That was the biggest success. It demonstrated that free India and democratic India was an experiment that has a very high chance of succeeding. Next, number two, next main point. In a hierarchical society, in a hierarchical society, comma, the principle of one person, one vote was revolutionary. Was revolutionary. Full stop. In a single stroke, centuries of social disability and political discrimination were wiped out. Were wiped out. ठीक है? Next लिखो. The myth that the illiterate Indian masses, that the illiterate Indian masses were unfit for democracy was shattered. Full stop. They rose above. They rose above the politics of caste, religion, language, or class, and rejected the divisive agenda of some parties of some parties to choose a progressive and secular society as promised by Congress, as promised by Congress. Full stop. Next point. The neutrality of state officials was another major achievement. Was another major achievement. Next point. The composition of the first Lok Sabha represented the true spirit of India. The true spirit of India. Why? Because every group, every class, every region, every language was represented in it. Okay? Of India. It was a real cross section of the nation. Some members were same point. Some members were rich, others poor, some educated, other others illiterate, some Hindi speakers, some regional, some Hindi speakers, some regional, some representing business interests, others workers, others workers, full stop. Business interests, some others workers, some were liberal and others orthodox. ठीक है, तो सोसाइटी का जो डाइवर्सिटी है दैट वाज रिफ्लेक्टेड इन दी लोकसभा. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट, the election the election also legitimized the constitution. कैसे? Because most of the members of the constituent assembly were elected to the first Lok Sabha. Since most former constituent assembly members were elected to the Lok Sabha, So the voters had given their approval to the constituent assembly and the constitution indirectly as well. ठीक है? Next main point, the success of the election silenced critics, both foreign and domestic. Right. Many critics, especially foreign ones, and even among them the British critics, were prophesizing that India would not last beyond 15 years or so, and sooner or later it is going to break apart into its millions of constituent parts. ठीक है, तो political unity पे बहुत ज़्यादा doubts उठाए जा रहे थे. But now the whole of India had come together and voted for a free and progressive and united India, that silenced those critics, that belied all those prophecies. ठीक है, so it silenced critics both foreign and domestic. Next main point, the success of the election also raised India's prestige. Especially among which countries? The newly independent countries, जहाँ पे decolonization या तो हो रहा था या होने वाला था. All those countries started looking towards India as a role model. Write down. Full stop. Newly independent countries of Asia and Africa began looking towards India as a role model. Right? Good. ठीक है. So this was the impact or significance of the first general elections. Another topic, democracy and first general elections, we have covered. हमारे क्या क्या टॉपिक्स बचते हैं? ट्राइबल इंटीग्रेशन, लैंड रिफॉर्म्स, communalism, Nehruvian foreign policy, and the emergence of environmentalism. Right? From tomorrow onwards, we are going to cover all these topics in this order only. मेरा एस्टिमेशन ये है कि कल की क्लास में हम ये 3 टॉपिक्स कवर कर लेंगे, बचे हुए 2 टॉपिक्स मंडे को हम कवर कर सकते हैं. ठीक है, चलिए देन, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम. आई विल सी यू इन आवर नेक्स्ट क्लास टुमारो.